So around the turn of the century, the author William Gibson had a quote that he was fond of repeating. "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." So it's impossible to predict the future with 100% accuracy, but every future that we will ever see didn't just come out of nowhere. It had a series of events, a series of data points that led up to it. And while you can't say exactly what things are going to be significant and which aren't, over time you can watch a pattern of development that shows how each of our futures came to be. So I have a little bit of a fun, geeky analogy that I use to try to explain open source software. And it has to do with the principle of the speed of sound. It also works with the speed of light, but I find that people have a harder time relating to travel at the speed of light than they do travel at the speed of sound. Crazy reason. So when an object makes a noise, the sound travels in waves out from the object, kind of like dropping a pebble in the water, and you can see the waves rippling outward. So the analogy is this is a little bit like software between the 40s and the 70s. It was a very slow, very regular pace of innovation. And curiously, software was not regarded as a valuable asset. In fact, many companies listed it as a $0 asset. It had no value. They valued the hardware, they sold the hardware, but the software was just kind of something that made the hardware work. Software at the time was not copyrightable. It wasn't protected by copyright law, which meant anyone, everywhere, could freely use, modify, and redistribute any software. And companies often were willing to just sort of ship you the software for free on the side. It was considered valuable when they were trying to, when you were trying to maintain your hardware to have the software, so that when you had a bug, you didn't have to wait for the manufacturer to fix your little one-line bug. You could just do it yourself. So there's a famous story that's in this period, that's sort of the first age of software, that a guy named Richard Stallman, he was working in MIT's AI lab, and he got a printer and had a lot of trouble with paper jams in the printer. So he modified the software for the printer to send out a network notice every time there was a paper jam, so someone could go and fix the printer and get it running again. And he didn't really think anything of it. It's like, of course he had access to the software. Of course he could make this little bitty change. That was just normal. That's what everybody did back then. So when an object starts to move, the sound waves still go out in the exact same pattern, but because the object is moving, you can kind of see the sound waves bunching up in the direction of, that it's traveling. And this is a little bit like, in the 70s, people started to talk about maybe software should be copyrightable. There started to be like little rumors. It's like a precursor to what might come next. And one of the most obvious signs was in the US, this Commission on New Technological Uses of Copyrighted Works started reviewing whether software should be copyrightable and what that might mean. Towards the end of the 70s, they recommended that it should be copyrightable, but it didn't actually change until the 80s. So in the first stage of software, you get this sort of very slow, regular pace. There's a funny thing that happens when an object is traveling exactly at the speed of sound. And that is, the sound is still traveling at exactly the same pace, but the object is traveling at the same pace. So as the sound waves go, the object keeps catching up with its own sound waves, and they build up bigger and bigger and bigger into this like turbulent, disruptive zone. At the time, they called that the sound barrier because pilots kept trying to pass that turbulent zone, and their planes would just fall apart. Pilots died trying to break through that sound barrier, that turbulent zone. They believed it was, in fact, completely impossible to cross that zone, that nothing ever, no man-made creation would ever be able to go faster than the speed of sound. And this kind of corresponds to the 80s. So in 1980, software copyright was entered into copyright law, so software became copyrightable. And this is a period of time where there was this huge boom of software innovation around proprietary software like Windows and Mac and Oracle. There was this burst of companies who were innovating in the software space. And they believed that it was that turbulent zone. They believed that turbulent zone of innovation was only because it was proprietary software. And that all that sort of free software that had been around before, the BSD and all the source code that had been available for people to modify and sort of help with their needs for technology, that was really just going to fall by the wayside. It was irrelevant. The future of innovation was all proprietary software. And yet, it kept growing. So you see that turbulent zone is a fairly small band, and over time that body of open software just kept growing and growing and growing, sort of like the sound waves spreading out further and further and further behind the plane as it travels. So in this time period, this guy, Richard Stallman, he got a new printer. And the new printer didn't have the software that he needed to apply that same fix he had made to make the printer more usable in the AI lab. And this kind of sparked off for him a whole revelation of, well, what if I can't modify the software? Does this mean that from now on I'll always have to go and wait for someone to give me the change when I need to make a fix? It's like being told that you can't move the furniture around in your bedroom because somebody else put that furniture there and you are no longer allowed to change it. So he came up with this idea called free software. The idea being that it should be sort of a basic human right to be able to modify your environment. And part of our environment today is the software that we're surrounded by. So I often describe it as free software was kind of like, it was an equal and opposite reaction to software copyright. Before software copyright existed, nobody cared. It was like, well, of course we share our software, it's no big deal. But as soon as you could lock it down, then people started realizing, well, there's some value also to opening it up. So let's start having this conversation. So at the time, people believed that proprietary software would always lead innovation. Like that was the new thing. In the 80s, it's like all the big businesses were like proprietary software. So here's the weird thing. So when an object travels faster than the speed of sound, you see this turbulent zone of like when the sound waves are all piling up because it's traveling exactly at the speed of sound. That all disappears. So the sound waves start falling behind the object, and that turbulent disruptive zone becomes a very, very narrow band. It turns out the sound barrier doesn't actually exist. It's just sort of a compounding of effects of physics precisely because the object is traveling at the same speed as the sound that it's producing. So you can kind of think of this third age of software as it's like a boat wake. So like the disruptive wake sort of travels behind you instead of getting in the way of the boat traveling. So this period corresponds to about the 2000s. There's a bunch of different, there's sort of a convergence of different effects that contributed to this shift. One of them was corporate adoption of free software, which led to a group of people to create a new name for it called open source, intending it to be the same thing, just it's easier to explain. Sometimes free software, people get confused that it just means no price instead of meaning freedom for humans to modify their environment. Another impact was the dot-com bubble. So at the time, free software had been seeing increasing adoption, and also suddenly all these companies had no money to spend on massive proprietary databases to run their pet food store. So this sort of stable, reliable open source software was suddenly much more appealing. And in the wake of the dot-com bubble, that sort of resurgence of new technology that we called Web 2.0 was all built on open source software. It was made possible because it was inexpensive and allowed people to innovate rapidly based on freely available resources. So, you know, this is sort of an economic necessity. If you can't afford a massive proprietary piece of software and there is a freely available alternative, you tend to switch to it. And even more so if your competitors are switching to freely available alternatives and you're still paying a big licensing fee for proprietary software, then you're going to end up at a competitive disadvantage. Another factor was that people started to realize, you know, it'd been about 20 years since proprietary software came about. People started to realize that when you're trying to drive forward innovation, having your software locked behind closed doors is not always the best way to do it, because it means people spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel over and over again instead of building on the innovation of the past. And there was some things like it's often a barrier to collaboration. You know, you may have one company with one set of ideas and another company with another set of ideas, and if they aren't willing to talk to each other, they may never realize that if they combined their two ideas, it would accelerate innovation even faster. It would produce something that was even more valuable to their customers. So part of that big transition around the 2000s was the concept of the collaborative process as a major driver of innovation. Now, it's not a silver bullet, right? Like, it's not magic. And human factors, like anytime you have to collaborate across different systems, communication becomes can be a huge barrier. It's something that you have to work on actively. So it's not that, you know, just throwing something out in the wild under an open source license magically makes it better. But there's sort of an inherent limitation of software that's locked behind closed door that it will never have the potential to benefit from the collaborative process. So open source really, around the 2000s, it shifted from being this sort of weird, fringy idea that people thought, oh, well, that's curious, to being a major driver of technology progress. And then what happened? So as an object travels faster than the speed of sound, the faster it travels, the wider the cone behind it grows and the narrower that disruptive barrier grows. So if you say that disruptive barrier is the zone where proprietary innovation is the leading innovation, or where a proprietary business model can succeed, it still exists. I mean, it certainly hasn't gone away by any means, but the larger that body of free software grows, then those opportunities for sort of succeeding by locking something down, they start to narrow to very unique zones of value. And you really have to start rethinking, you know, I still see people assuming that locking something down is the best way to make a profit off of it. Sometimes it is. But sometimes you're actually going to do better by taking advantage of the freely available resources more and more over time. And that growing body of technology, that growing body of freely available technical resources become a force to accelerate innovation. Because instead of losing those new ideas as you go along, you have more and more access to more and more ideas over time. So this brings us to about the 2010s today. There was a survey, two surveys in fact, one run in 2010 and one in 2015 by the same company, Black Duck. So they measured use of open source in 2010 as 42% of companies, and in 2015 it was 78% of companies, and it's only grown in the past year. And an interesting factor, in 2015 they measured participation in open source at 64% of companies. I think that surprises a lot of people because they assume that most open source is just sort of consuming a freely available external resource. And what happened really is around 2010, open source became so common that it's table stakes for entry in a way to technology. If you aren't using it at all, and really I don't know any companies that aren't using it at all, then if you aren't using it at all, you're at a disadvantage. So choosing to use freely available resources when they're appropriate, it's like that's just the base entry layer. And then participation becomes a competitive edge. So the companies that are participating in the open source projects, they get their needs listened to. Like those projects, they hear the use cases that the company has for open source, and they see the bug reports that the company is struggling with, and they see the feature requests that the company wants. And it's not like you're telling them what to do, but you become a part of their ecosystem. You become a part of what matters to them. And that influences the direction of the project as a whole to be more valuable to you as a consumer of open source. And that's something that is really only possible with open source, right? If you have just sort of this software locked behind a wall and you get to take what they give you, and you could probably give a bug report, but they don't really, they're not really going to invite you to participate in the whole design process. It's a unique advantage of open source. And it's part of what drives the rapid innovation from open source is because you have those ideas, from hundreds and thousands of different users of different use cases. It pushes forward the demand for the software to make progress in a way that it wouldn't do if it was just hidden behind a wall. So that has this snowball effect, right? So the more companies use open source, then the more they're driven to participate in open source, and the more they participate, the better the software becomes. And when the software becomes better, then more people use it, and when more people use it, they're driven to participate, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. And this sort of explains, if you look at the pattern of open source software over time, it's just going faster and faster and faster, and there's more and more available in terms of the software that you need. So this is an old quote, but it's one, looking at the past, again, you can see at the time, I doubt anybody noticed it, but I can see the significant bit developing over the past 50 years. Many people assume, wrongly, that a company exists simply to make money. While this is an important result of a company's existence, we have to go deeper and find the real reasons for our being. As we investigate this, we inevitably come to the conclusion that a group of people get together and exist as an institution that we call a company, like Cerner, so they are able to accomplish something collectively which they could not accomplish separately. They are able to do something worthwhile. They make a contribution to society. So Tim O'Reilly, who was one of the sort of visionaries behind open source and Web 2.0 and a variety of other technology progress movements since then, has lately been talking about something that he calls the next economy. And he's kind of trying to explain the success of companies like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, who are really doing things in a different way than traditional technology development. So he identifies 6 key aspects of what they're doing differently. And it really kind of comes down to disruptive innovation. So this is not your grandfather's pace of innovation. This is the modern day where innovation gets faster and faster and faster. One of them is absolutely gorgeous user experiences, focusing on how the user goes through your software or how the software that you provide affects them in a direct way. Another is what he calls augmenting workers. So your software isn't just there in their lives. It's not just pushing buttons. It actually empowers them to be more effective at whatever they're doing, or even empowers them to take on roles and responsibilities that they couldn't do without the software. And he talks about redesigning services in a way that's not just the small impact, but really taking a step back and figuring out what your service provides and how to change the experience of the user. So that's more on the qualitative aspect. On the quantitative aspect, you're looking for value on a much wider scale. So you don't just want like this one piece of software that one person will use. He talks about driving innovation so that platforms enable networks. And like Uber is an example of this. It's just a platform. It's just an app and a server and some data that gets passed around. There's nothing really magical about it. But the network of like physical virtual reality change that it brought about is amazingly powerful. And transforming industry structure is about not being satisfied with just continuing to provide software that does things exactly the same way that it always has been done, but really changing the impact of that software on the humans who use it. And then creating an ecosystem is, again, this is like a quantitative idea of don't just have this one little space, but create value in a way that actually drives the economy. So it's not just one little piece of value for one customer, but seeing how it all works together as a system. So in some ways, this is really just business 101, right? It's not spectacular. It's, business is creating value for customers such that they're willing to pay more for it than it cost you to produce it. Baseline, that's what business is. But it's a new, I would say it's like a new take on customer value that really gets down to the impact on our clients, on our users, on our customers. It's not enough to just say, well, it markets well and people are willing to pay money for it. It's really taking a step beyond and saying, what impact are we having on human society through the software and technology that we produce? And then seeing that, hey, you know what? Customers are actually willing to pay a whole lot more for software that changes their lives for the better than software that just kind of, does the same thing they've been doing for 10 years in exactly the same way with like different colored buttons. And this kind of brings back to what do customers really value? And do customers value the software license that you sell them? A lot of software today is based on a software license. You sell them a software license. But the fact is, customers don't actually value software licenses. They don't care about the license. They care about the impact that it has on their lives. And as a result, you can give someone open source software that changes their lives. Here's a secret. They'll pay exactly the same amount as they would for proprietary software because the license is not what they care about. So I kind of think of it as we collectively who get to work in the technology space, we are the modern day wizards. We have the power to fundamentally alter the environment that people around us live in. Software is not some weird thing off to the side anymore. Software lives in our pockets, on our phones. It lives in our cars. It lives in our houses. It lives everywhere. And we have the power to make that better for people. It's about creating opportunities for humans. To come back to the quote, it's about making a contribution to society. And that can be like any of hundreds of ways. If we can make doctors more effective at their jobs, we're making a contribution to society. If we can make patients have a better experience, be better informed, get better results, then we're making a contribution to society. So there's a piece of conventional wisdom you will sometimes hear floating around, and it's you can't make money off of free software. It's free. How could you make money off of it? And at first glance that seems like, oh, well, of course, right, it's free. How do you make money off of it? But actually that's about the same thing as saying you can't make money off of trees. Trees grow for free in the forest. Like, you can't make money off of that. Maybe you can't make money off of just selling a field with a bunch of trees growing in it. It's not much more valuable than just selling the field without the trees growing in it. A little bit, but not much. But as you add customer value, it totally changes the proposition. So if you cut down the trees and you deliver them to someone's door as firewood, they'd pay you a little more for it. If you cut them into 2x4s and sell them to construction industry, they'll pay a little bit more for it. And if you cut them into like gorgeous, ornate, custom designed furniture, they will pay an enormous amount for it. So it's all about viewing software, freely available software, as a resource. And the fact that it's a freely available resource does not in any way change the fact that you can add customer value to it and deliver more value to your customers. Which brings us to the next piece of the metaphor, and that is sustainability. So if you just cut down the trees and you keep cutting and cutting and cutting and you never plant new ones, eventually there won't be any trees. And with open source software, this plays back in, if you just use the software, it's totally fine. You can. That's expected. That's allowed. But then you have to wonder, well, who's going to keep growing the software 20 years from now if everyone is just consuming it and no one is actually contributing it? It becomes much more of like a natural resource. So here's my survival guide to the future. Open source is on the rise. It's pretty much impossible to ignore it at this point. If you aren't using it, your competitors are probably using it. And just using it is enough. It can change your software, it can change your technology, it can change your company in incredible ways, even if you just stay with use. But then you have to think about, are you using it effectively? So you could just say, we use this one random piece here and there. But it's far more effective if you actually include open source in your overall technology strategy and consider all the factors and all the positives and negatives and where it fits the best. So it's a free resource. It can boost your development cycle as you're making new products for customers. It can also, over time, all software ages, and it gets bloated, and it gets slow, and it gets clunky, and it no longer has the features that people want. So there's kind of I would say, a renewal cycle, or almost a recycling process, where sometimes with really old software, it makes more sense to replace certain components or even large pieces of it with new software, with like open source software, than to redevelop it from scratch internally. And that can also be a big cost savings in terms of long-term maintenance and development of a product. So you kind of need to keep that view out of like what open source software is out there and what's going to matter to your base. In terms of commodity, like over time, something that was really exciting 20 years ago, it will become less and less and less exciting as every company is selling exactly the same thing and it's no longer a differentiator. So you kind of have to keep an eye on, well, where are those points where actually sharing the cost of development with a dozen, 100 other companies through an open source project on some particular shared commodity, very commonly used piece of software is a better economic plan than trying to have each company individually, writing it themselves. And by doing that, by consciously strategizing around what pieces could be replaced with a freely available resource, you get to focus your resources on where your unique value is. So as you're focusing your engineers, it's kind of a waste if you have a large number of engineers working on a project that is really almost exact parity for a freely available open source project. There's impedance mismatch. You really have to think about making a transition. But it should certainly be on your radar. That should be the kind of thing that is considered in every major software renovation or architecture change is this a time where freely available resources would actually serve us better? And once you get there, then strategize about participation as well. Because if you're just using it, that's fine. But if you can communicate to the projects that you use why you use them and what you need from them and what matters to you over the next 10 or 20 years, then over time that software will become more and more adapted to what you need. If you just sit back and you don't talk to anyone, you risk the possibility that someone else may communicate a completely different need, and no one will ever consider why you were using that piece of software in the first place, and it will end up drifting away from your needs. And then you have the cost of transitioning, and it's just good economic sense to invest in the open source projects that you're using. And I actually tend to use those exact words. It's an investment. It's an investment of resources into an open source software project in very much the same way as you would strategize about what resources to invest in an internal project. So open source can be a competitive advantage if you choose to use it, if you choose to participate in it. It's not an obligation, it's just there on the table. The future is open, and I mean that both in the sense that open source software is growing and growing and growing, and it's not going away. But I also mean that in the sense that the future is open to us to decide what it's going to be. For us to determine how software is going to be, for us to determine how the experience of users is going to be. So my somewhat blessing to you is, please go and use your wizardly powers of technology for good. Thank you.